All right. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the Kriependruck Stock Market News. My name is Elias Kriependruck, and I am the founder of the Kriependruck Stock Market News, which is basically a podcast in which I summarize and explain every trading day. Now, what I usually do on this YouTube channel is I pick a question of the day and I answer that question. And these questions are, of course, highly relevant and highly applicable to current markets in general and to the economy as a whole. Now, today will be a little bit different. Today, I will hold a presentation that will allow you to gain a clearer view in a very foggy economic environment at the moment. And what this presentation will come down to is essentially will tell you what the current data is telling us about the state of the US economy, and hence it will explain to you how that data will affect the further monetary policy decisions of the Federal Reserve. Now, we will kind of start from scratch here. I will kind of explain to you in what kind of situation the Federal Reserve currently is in and what kind of problems the Federal Reserve currently has. Now, there are mainly two problems of the Fed at the moment. One problem is that the Federal Reserve is very dependent on economic data. However, economic data is backwards looking because monetary policy affects the economy with a significant lag. Hence, we have not really seen the accumulated effect of all the previous interest rate hikes on the economy, because those interest rate hikes will affect the economy with a significant lag. Being dependent on economic data hence means that the Fed is dependent on lagging indicators. Now, the second problem is the Federal Reserve is using a framework that is built for fixing deficient aggregate demand. But the problem we're in right now, I believe that the economy is in a state of deficient aggregate supply. Hence, the Federal Reserve is fixing a problem that it cannot directly influence. And that is obviously another problem of the Fed. Now, we will mostly talk about the first problem, which is the problem of being too dependent on economic data and lagging indicators. Now, the first problem that arises is a lot of volatility in capital markets. I said this in a previous presentation as well, so stick with me here. The fact that the Fed is so dependent on economic data means that the markets are essentially interpreting every single data point that is being released, and based on that released data point, they're deciding how that data point could affect the further development of monetary policy. Now, the problem is the current economic data is very mixed. For example, we sometimes get a weak ISM PMI manufacturing data report indicating that in some sectors the economy is indeed slowing down, but at the same time, we're getting a labor market report that is showing that the unemployment rate fell to 3.5%. At the same time, we're seeing that the employment cost index shows that wages are still rising. And in addition to that, around 80% of the reported earnings so far, because we're in the midst of earnings season, 80% of the reported earnings so far have been better than expected. And more than half of the S&P 500 companies have reported earnings already. So we're in this environment of mixed economic data where we have underlying strength of the economy. At the same time, we are seeing some weakness. So the markets are sometimes reacting to weak economic data, and they're saying, hey, we're seeing this weakness. The Federal Reserve will not be so hawkish. They will cut rates. But then on the next day, we're getting very strong economic data indicating that the Federal Reserve has to keep rates at a higher level for longer. And obviously, this reaction to mixed economic data creates a lot of volatility. And just take a look at the 2-year Treasury yield volatility here as an example. Here you have a really beautiful chart of the Financial Times that shows this eye-popping fluctuations in the 2-year Treasury yields in March. So in March, the 2-year Treasury yield has been trading in a range of from 3.58% to 5%, 5.08%. And that is really incredible volatility, especially if you consider that the 2-year Treasury yield is usually anchored to a strategy of the Fed, but the Federal Reserve doesn't have a strategy at the moment. It is dependent on mixed economic data. So, and this creates a problem because this volatility in markets, this volatility in the 2-year Treasury yield makes cash management very hard, and it has other implications also for the economy as a whole. Now, the second problem of being too data dependent is basically a high risk of making a wrong decision, because obviously if you are not convinced by a certain belief, if you're not convinced by a certain strategy, you're going to have to react to that economic data, but that is sending you mixed signals. So the risk is very high that you either over tighten by keeping rates at a higher level for too long, or at too high of a level for too long. And there's also a risk that you start to cut too soon because some areas of the economy show weakness. So you need to consider if the current data that the economy is basically giving us, does that data allow us to extrapolate a certain scenario to the economy as a whole? But overall, this dependency on lagging indicators definitely creates this high risk of making a wrong decision. Now, Mohamed El-Erian, a very renowned economist, I'm a big fan. He's president of Queen's College, and he wrote a very nicely written piece, an opinionated piece for the Financial Times recently. And he basically believes that we live in a world of deficient aggregate supply. So what I'm going to do in this part of the presentation now, I will analyze this belief. I will analyze this opinion that we live in a world of deficient aggregate supply. And I will tell you if this is a strategy that the Federal Reserve could potentially be anchored to. Well, at the core of this belief are basically three important points. Deficient aggregate supply has been basically created by 3 points. Now, the first point is companies, and this is a trend, a phenomena we have seen throughout the past month, throughout the past year. When the Ukraine war started, also in the pandemic, we're seeing that companies are rewiring their supply chains. Now, sometimes this obviously increases production costs, but generally this puts a constraint on supply. So it definitely contributes to the belief that we live in a world of deficient aggregate supply. Now, the second point that speaks for that view is that geopolitics having an increasingly stronger influence on economics. If you look, obviously, once again, at the past few months, at the past year, the Ukraine war, the events in China, obviously COVID outbreaks in China, generally the way the United States are dealing with China from an economic perspective, the fact that geopolitics have such an increasing effect on economics means that we're not policymakers or politicians are not, their opinions are not, their actions are not based on economic efficiency, on economic theory anymore, but on geopolitical issues. And that puts a constraint on supply as well, because ensuring sufficient supply is not the number one goal anymore. Now, the third point contributing to a world of deficient aggregate supply is obviously having an incredibly tight labor market. The most recent jobs report showed that the unemployment rate, in fact, fell again to 3.5%. Now, you must remember, having supply side issues does not automatically create a world of deficient aggregate supply. Obviously, you also need to have a very high demand, right? So in order to analyze the reliability of the view of Mohamed El-Erian, we need to take a look at earnings season. We need to take a look at the underlying strength of the consumer. So let's do that very quickly because it is very, very helpful, very insightful. Now, if you take a look at the screen here, there you see 4 companies, and these 4 companies have one crucial thing in common, and it is only an example of a few companies here. We have seen this phenomena throughout this earnings season. We have seen companies that are able to increase their prices without a significant fall in sales volume. Now, this especially is true for those companies you see here on the screen: Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Pepsi. All of these companies have been able to raise their prices without a significant decrease in sales, meaning that obviously they can increase their margins. But the fact that they're raising their prices puts a lot of pressure on inflation, obviously, inflation in the broad economy. So the fact that they are still able to pass on these higher prices to resilient consumers puts a lot of inflationary pressures on the economy, meaning that it makes it harder for the Federal Reserve to restore price stability by bringing inflation back to the 2% target. Now, what you need to ask yourself is, where does the strength of the consumer truly come from? Now, there are three major reasons why we have seen such a strong consumer and why the consumer still remains so strong. Now, the first reason is strong consumer finances have increased spending power of people at the bottom of the income distribution. We have seen, in fact, we have seen now during the pandemic and especially after the pandemic, especially people earning low wages have seen the biggest increase, meaning that they have gained significant spending power. Now, if you take this in addition to the, like I just said, the distribution of post-pandemic income gains, this has a lot of macroeconomic implications. And it could definitely mean that growth and inflation is stickier than we currently expect. Now, obviously, another reason for the underlying strength of the consumer is a very, very tight labor market, and we're basically at full employment right now, a unemployment rate of only 3.5%. So you're seeing these significant wage gains. At the same time, you see people at the bottom of the income distribution gaining significant spending power. And at the same time, like I said, the unemployment rate is very low. So this in general means that the consumer as a whole throughout the economy is very resilient, which of course means that they can keep spending money, which means that it will be very hard for the Fed in such an environment to restore price stability. Now, like I said, once again, an example of the strong consumer right here, two beautiful charts from the Financial Times. You can see on the chart on the left-hand side right here that the lowest paid Americans have experienced the strongest pay growth. You can see the bottom 10% of the earners truly outperforming the other classes, median average and the top 10% of the earners. So that has a lot of macroeconomic implications. Now, if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, we have seen a significant increase in expenditure on goods. Most of the increase has been during the pandemic, but since then, it has kind of stayed on such a high level. It has become sticky, right? So that is what I just said, basically, these macroeconomic implications. We're seeing an increase in spending power, and that means growth, as we can see here, spending on goods, and hence also inflation is stickier, has become stickier and is stickier than most of us expect. Now, the same thing obviously is the case. If you let inflation migrate from just a few goods to the service sector as a whole, inflation simply becomes much stickier and less sensitive to interest rate hikes. So this is definitely a macroeconomic phenomena that will make it probably indicates that the Fed has to keep rates at a higher level for longer. Now, let's just take a look at the economic data we've gotten in the past weeks, especially last week or kind of this week. We got a lot of economic data, and that tells you a lot about the economy, obviously. Now, the GDP sector grew a little bit slower than expected. There should not be a negative sign here. Please ignore that. I'm sorry. The economy grew by 1.1% instead of an expected growth of 2%. Now, that does indicate that the economy is indeed losing some momentum. However, and this is what I've been talking about all along, we're seeing some weakness in the economy, but at the same time, there is this underlying strength in some sectors. If you look at consumer spending, for example, it reached the strongest level in almost 2 years in the first quarter of 2023. We have seen a 0.2% increase month over month in February. It did not increase again in March, so that is indeed a good sign, but it also didn't decrease. So it might just become a sticky, it might stagnate at the current level. Now, headline PCE, also very interesting. Headline personal consumption expenditures increased by 0.1% compared to a 0.3% increase in February. So we're also kind of losing some momentum there. But then essentially it all comes down to core PCE. Core PCE is the most important inflation measure for the Federal Reserve, or one of the most important measure for underlying inflation. And that grew by 0.3% in March, which is the same as in February. So once again, we're seeing the stickiness to inflation. Now, year over year, core PCE is at 4.6%. The Federal Reserve wants it to fall to 3.5%. And based on data since the 1960s, the average unemployment rate during periods in which core PCE was at 3.5% or below, the average unemployment rate during those periods was actually 5.5%, so much higher. And just in general, another fun fact, another indication that the unemployment rate has to rise in order for inflation to fall back to the 2% target. Now, the savings rate, plus 5%, which is obviously also an increase compared to February, which shows obviously that the consumer might be spending a little bit less. We're seeing no increase in consumer spending here in March, but savings are increasing, which also shows that the consumer obviously is still resilient. Now, employment cost index, very important for the Fed because obviously wage growth has a significant effect on inflation, on the resilience of the consumer. Wages and salaries grew by 1.2% in the first quarter of 2023, compared to a 1% increase during the last 3 months of 2022. So definitely we're still seeing a significant increase there. And I just do not see how that wage growth, especially if you look at the service sector, can come down significantly throughout this year, or come down to such an extent that the Fed will actually be able to cut rates. Now, another very important fact for the general state of the economy is obviously the banking sector. Now, take a look at another beautiful chart from the Financial Times. This chart shows you the yield on BBB corporate bonds, and at the same time, it tells you the spread. Now, what you can see here, obviously, the yield on BBB corporate bonds significantly increased because you have seen treasury yields increase as well. But the spread remains very low. Now, what does this tell you? It tells you that we're not at a significant risk of default at the moment, which is an indication that that the credit sector, that the availability of credit, that in general this headwind to credit growth and to outstanding loans is still very small. So companies are still able to finance themselves, especially companies that have kind of been dependent on taking up loans for in order to survive, those so-called zombie companies. Just generally speaking, I don't want to make it too complicated. The fact that we're not seeing an increase in defaults, in credit defaults, is an indication that we're far away from a credit crunch, essentially. Now, what you must consider is, according to the Financial Times, half of the banks say that they are tightening their credit standards. And in addition to that, we have seen a lot of banks are actually lending money from Federal Reserve lending institutions at a very, very high interest in order to still guarantee deposits. We have obviously seen an outflow of deposits because of higher yields on treasuries and bonds in general. So the fact that banks have to lend more at a high interest, that will decrease net interest income, and the fact that net interest margins decrease, that net interest income decreases, puts banks in a difficult spot and difficult situation, which means that we will see headwind to credit growth and economic activity. And basically, Dominic White phrased this very beautifully from Absolute Strategy Research. Now, in the current earnings season, we are seeing that banks are still incredibly resilient. And like I said right here, at the what you can also see when looking at the chart at the spreads, right, and the rising yields at the same time of BBB corporate bonds, we can see that we are not seeing an increase in credit defaults. So the banking sector is still in a good position. Financial stability is still in a good position, but we are seeing some headwind to credit growth. And I believe that headwind will continue going forward. Now, what you must remember, that is not good. I will be right back. All right. What you must remember is that the Federal Reserve basically is in a trilemma, right? They need to ensure financial stability. They need to ensure full employment, at the same time ensure price stability. Now, what the current earnings season is telling you, and what this chart is essentially telling you, financial stability is still guaranteed, right? We're still seeing financial stability. At the same time, we're at full employment. We can see that the unemployment rate fell to 3.5%, the unemployment rate, which means that we are still at full employment. So the biggest problem of the Fed is obviously price stability right now. So they will continue to focus on that. Now, what can we conclude? What can we conclude about the view of Mohamed El-Erian? What can we conclude about the recent economic data and the events within the financial sector? Now, I believe essentially it makes a lot of sense, Mohamed El-Erian's opinion, that we live in a world of deficient aggregate supply. The consumer is incredibly resilient. We're still seeing supply chain issues, geopolitical issues. Companies are rewiring their supply chains. Demand is still at a high level, meaning that we live in a world of deficient aggregate supply, and that has inflationary pressures. Now, the fact that the Fed cannot influence the supply side of the economy through interest rate hikes, of course, that is a big problem. So what the Fed needs to do is they need to slow down demand enough for supply and demand in order to be in equilibrium again. And if that is the case, they can indeed bring inflation back to the 2% target. But in order for supply and demand to be realigned, they need to keep interest rates at a high level for long enough in order for the consumer to lose some of that incredible resilience. And the current interest rate hike cycle is a bit different from previous ones because of the pandemic, because of the macroeconomic implications that have been created by the pandemic. So obviously, I think that will cause the Fed to keep rates at a higher level for longer. And I do not expect rate cuts this year, which are being priced in by markets currently. But of course, the environment is very foggy. It is very, economic data is very mixed. So it is hard to truly stand behind one single opinion, because you just need to keep looking at, you need to keep considering what the economic data is telling you. But essentially, I believe this view of Mohamed El-Erian, that we live in a world of sufficient aggregate supply, could be something that a strategy that the Fed could be anchored to. And that strategy would essentially reduce a lot of volatility that we're seeing currently in the market. So it would make life easier for all of us. Now, looking at the economic data in general, I believe generally we are seeing some headwinds to the economy. We are seeing the economy lose momentum. We are seeing financial stability kind of start to deteriorate a little bit. And we see credit availability narrowing, which is essentially what needs to happen in order for price stability to be restored. But we're not seeing any significant, we're not seeing a credit crunch, and we're not seeing a significant weakening in the economy, because the labor market remains so resilient, because consumer spending remains so resilient. So essentially, I believe, just kind of looking ahead to next week, what all the economic data of the past week means for the Fed is that they will sound pretty hawkish during the next meeting. I believe I would be absolutely shocked, based on employment cost index, core PCE, resilience of the consumer. I would be shocked if the Federal Reserve does not raise interest rates by another 25 basis points in the next meeting. And based on all of this economic data we have gotten, I believe that the Federal Reserve will also sound relatively hawkish at next week's FOMC meeting. All right, well, there was a lot to talk about in one single presentation, but I still hope that you enjoyed today's presentation of the Kriventalk stock market news. Now, another episode will be released on Monday. Also, make sure to check out our new podcast episode on Monday that will be released. Now, if you want the Kriventalk stock market news to cover a certain question of the day, just write it in the comments, and we will make sure to answer your question. Now, enjoy the rest of the weekend and have a great start to the next week.